Hello everyone, my name is Protesilaos, also known as Prot. In today's video, I will talk to you about the topic of conventions, relativism, and cosmopolitanism. This is a continuation of my first presentation about the living universe and specifically the profound significance of the words cosmos and logos. It also complements my second presentation about ataraxia, moderation, and mysticism. Here I provide links to my website where you can read or watch those presentations. I recommend that you study them or at least have a general idea of what they deal with. And just to note this, by the way, that the text for this presentation as well will be published on my website. So if you are watching this on the video hosting platform, there will be a link to my website in the description of the video. So what I will do today is draw linkages between the general concepts about the world and our everyday affairs, based on a distinction between objectivity and subjectivity. This means that I will refer to magnitudes such as politics and ethics in light of the view that the universe is alive. We will discuss how everything compares with the insight about leading a life of moderation. And I will explain how all these connections can be drawn using specific examples here and analyzing the relevant concepts. So as with my previous videos as well as with the previous presentations, I will start out with some definitions. Then I will explain what one term that I will reference is. So hrimata is the term, but I will explain what this is at the outset. So we will see what hrimata are, and we will consider them in many cases so that the concept is crystal clear. Then I will proceed to a consideration of relativism and objectivity. Then we have conventions and nature, pragmata, which is another term that I will explain in the definitions, pragmata and cosmopolitanism, and we will conclude with a general theme about the utility of ideals. So with those granted, let me start the presentation view. So I'm narrowing to each section one at a time, and we begin with the definitions. So there are only a couple of terms that I want you to learn today. The first one is pragma or pragmata. Pragma is the singular, while pragmata is the plural. So these refer to a thing as it is, a thing regardless of how we would like to think of it. The term relates to the concept of pragmatism, which we use in English, of course, which is the disposition of a person who takes things for what they are, things as they are. I am using here pragmatism as a proxy because I think it helps us understand pragma and pragmata. So pragmatism or pragmatismos in Greek. So pragmatism in its basic form is about setting aside one's preferences or notions of how things ought to be, while accepting the prevailing conditions for what they are. So this is pragma and pragmata. And then we have hrima and hrimata. Hrima is the singular, hrimata is the plural. In everyday parlance, this is the Greek word for money. It derives from the root word for usage. By extension, then, hrimata are things that attain a value through usage, a use value, or more generally, an extrinsic value. This is true for all forms of money in the immediate sense, whose value as being money is determined exogenously to them. It is not a matter of their own qualities, and I will analyze this further into the presentation. Money does not have monetary value in itself, but only acquires it in the context of how it is used, given the relevant economic and/or legal political forces. In turn, hrimata are all things which can be thought of as different or used in a different way than intended. Our conception of them influences them insofar as the intersection between the human element and the objective reality is concerned. In other words, hrimata are the opposite of pragmata, and we will see this in practice. So let's start with the section hrimata and the extrinsic value of money, because I already mentioned in the definition of hrimata that this word literally means money in everyday Greek. And we want to see how that definition extends to the general concept of use value, or anyhow an extrinsic quality. We may describe use value as context dependent, or else as being relative. Let us consider why that is with some economic examples before drawing general conclusions. Suppose you are a farmer who cultivates potatoes. You live in a place where a barter economy is in effect. This means that you must exchange your goods or services for those supplied by someone else, with those supplied by someone else. So you can trade, for example, 1 kilogram of potatoes for a kilo of rice. In this scenario, the monetary value of potatoes is equal to that of rice given the same weight. However, there is nothing in the nature of either the potatoes or the rice which makes them inherently monetary. For our purposes, their nature is that of plants which can be eaten. Because of the barter economy, though, we can think of potatoes and rice in terms of what they can buy. Potatoes exchanging for rice and vice versa. Though we can just as well only treat them for what they are to us, which is food. Them attaining the function of money as a medium of exchange is a matter of the prevailing conditions, and them having a one-to-one exchange rate is also not a universal constant, as it depends on the specifics of the case. Now you may think that the goods in our example do have something in their nature which makes them suitable as monetary media. They are items which we want to acquire because they are edible, let's say. Which is fine. So how about a form of money which is not clearly valuable in itself, such as a piece of paper we call dollar, euro, etc. These are called fiat money because they are instituted by state fiat, else edict or a legally binding command. What makes paper money worth its monetary value? Is it its inherent utility as paper? Then why is a 5 euro bill not the same as a 50 euro bill, given that their production quality is the same? Their monetary value is at first the stamp of authority, its authenticity as defined by the government, the central bank, or related. Then is the fact that it is enacted as the legal form of money. You can only pay your taxes in it and engage in other legal transactions. And of course, legal transactions typically means taxable transactions. We can add more considerations as we consider the uses of money as a unit of account and store of value apart from a medium of exchange, that is, only to realize that we are always dealing with a case of something that has use value, else extrinsic or relative features. So this is what we really need to keep in mind. Continuing with this point, you might think that gold or other precious metals and minerals are excluded from this description. Perhaps you believe that they have value in themselves, being precious and all that. And that is wrong. They are not exceptions to what I just mentioned. What holds true for potatoes and fiat money applies equally to precious metals or any other goods for that matter. Suppose you find yourself in the middle of Antarctica. There is no sign of human presence in the vicinity. You are strangled in the middle of nowhere and are freezing to death. Suddenly, a magical spirit appears. It offers you the choice between a makeshift house and a chest full of gold. The former will save you from certain death, as it will provide you with shelter and warmth, whereas the latter can theoretically be exchanged for goods and services, though there are none to be found in the area since there are no humans around. Under normal circumstances, then, you would most likely prefer the treasure over some basic housing. Yet, in relative terms, and given the prevailing conditions, you have to opt for the makeshift house. Otherwise, you will die from extreme cold. In this scenario, gold has no value because it cannot be used for anything that matters in the moment. Its value is also extrinsic because it comes from its usage in the context. It would have value if things were to change, or it could have value rather. We should thus not conflate the qualities of any given thing, of gold in this case, such as its rarity and durability, with how humans may interpret or make use of them in any one set of circumstances. The qualities themselves may be constant, but their function or utility from their intersection with the human agent is not constant. So humans determine what a hrima is and how it is. The context is essential. So we will see this further by considering another example. And now I want to talk about hrimata and this idea of presented by René Magritte, a painter, who talked about this is not a pipe. So let me toggle this image here that I have over here. This is what I am referencing when I am saying that this is not a pipe. So what we have here, hopefully you can see everything. So what we have here is a painting of René Magritte. So what I just mentioned about hrimata is not specific to money or economic affairs in general. They apply to every case where human perception is involved. So now I want us to consider the problematic, the research question that involves the famous painting of René Magritte. This painting is called La Trahison des Images, else the treachery of images. And what Magritte presents us with is the drawing of a pipe accompanied by the caption in French, this is not a pipe. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. So we have to wonder, let me close this. I think you already saw it. You can pause the video if you need to look at it some more. And let me disable the preview so that we can focus on the text. So you may think that Magritte is trying to trick us, that something is amiss here. This is some kind of a trick question. Though Magritte is no trickster, the caption that this is not a pipe is correct, because what we see in that pipe is the drawing of a pipe, not a pipe as such. Consequently, the picture or pictorial representation of a thing is not the same as the thing itself. The caption in the painting is accurate. We could say this for anything, such as a selfie of you is not you. But let's stick to our example with Magritte. If the picture of a pipe is not a pipe, then we surely know what the underlying object is. In other words, we can answer the question of what is a pipe anyway? It clearly is not the painting. Though what is the underlying reality presented in this work of art, and how do we think of it? We would assume that the real pipe is the physical object of that same name, so some pipe that we can touch. And we would be justified in that belief if we were to associate the object with its function of serving as a tool for smoking tobacco or whatnot. Put differently, we identify the real, in quotes, thing by finding the one which fits the role we have already assumed as a given. We have thought that pipe is that which is used for smoking, and so anything that is not used towards that end cannot be a pipe, even though it looks like a pipe. Is that association correct? Is a physical pipe, that thing that we can touch, necessarily used for smoking? Is it a pragma, a thing as is? Or might it be yet another hrimata? The answer is that a physical pipe is a hrimata because it can perform functions that are not related to the original intent behind its design. The original intent is irrelevant in that regard. Think about the actual pipe that René Magritte used in his studio as a model for the painting. That was clearly not being used in the same way as a smoker's pipe is. Its value or utility had nothing to do with whether it could hold or filter tobacco. Rather, the physical object served the role of a model, still nature, as we say in art. So it served the role of a still nature, something that the painter was looking at and drawing. Or more generally, was employed as a means of artistic expression. It follows that the pipe in Magritte's studio could also come with the caption, "This is not a pipe." But wait, because it does not stop there. Suppose that a collector found the physical pipe that was used by René Magritte. This famous item could be exhibited in a museum, or in another scenario, it could be auctioned and sold for a sum that far exceeds the price of any other pipe. You get the idea. Again, we observe the same pattern where the human element makes the difference in how something is perceived in its context. We can always have the same identical underlying thing, Magritte's pipe in this instance, and still assign to it a different value or utility depending on the situation. In one case, it is a model in some painter's studio. In another case, it is exhibited at a museum. It is an asset in the marketplace, and so on. And of course, it can be used for smoking. All of them may come with the caption, "This is not a pipe." So what is a pipe? And the answer to that question is that it depends on the case. We cannot know about it in abstract because a pipe, and anything for that matter, does not have a standalone presence. It does not exist in abstract, in some decontextualized vacuum. We must thus consider the specifics, the factors at play, the constitution of the case, as I explained in my first presentation about cosmos, logos, and the living universe. Otherwise, we are assuming a built-in goal or purpose for the thing, some intrinsic truthfulness, which in truth merely reflects our predisposition, so how we think its nature is, so what we think it should be doing by default. So this is what we think, not what actually happens. Moving on to the next section, again I am considering hrimata, and I think you already understand what we are trying to say with this word. So in this section I want to talk about hrimata and the human measure of Protagoras. Protagoras, who I would not be surprised if his friends also called Prot, but anyway, Protagoras was an ancient philosopher who is best known for his dictum, human is the measure of all things. And in Greek, this is pandon hrimaton metron anthropos. In the original Greek version, we encounter the term hrimata, and I have it here as well. Hrimaton is just a variation of hrimata. So we must consider whether things, as it is translated in English, should come with a proviso based on what I have explained thus far about use value, extrinsic properties, and so on. Unfortunately, we only have fragments of Protagoras' work, so I can only expound on my own theories. First, let's take the English phrase at face value. Human is the measure of all things. This may sound naive if we take it to mean that everything is relative to us. Is a single human responsible for, let's say, the Earth orbiting the Sun, or for the Sun existing at all? If a single human is neither the cause nor a factor in the emergence of these phenomena, maybe humanity as a whole can make a difference? The answer has to be negative, because those magnitudes of the Earth's orbit and the Sun and so on are not dependent on the presence or the workings of humankind. So is Protagoras wrong? Not necessarily, because the ancient philosopher was above all not talking about pragmata, about things as they are. He was referring to hrimata, whose multitude of significations all entail use value or an extrinsic quality more broadly. Haven't we already considered how the perception of potatoes in a barter economy, or gold and a makeshift house in Antarctica, or René Magritte's pipe are all a matter of the specifics? Didn't we establish that the context is essential to our understanding of the phenomenon, and by extension that no valuation can be made in abstract? Those items are all hrimata insofar as humans are concerned. We can thus argue that human, be it an individual or the genus of human, so humankind, is their measure. A better translation then of Protagoras' dictum is that human is the measure of the use value of things. Then we have the notion of a measure, which implies perception, not causality. Even if we are talking about something that is clearly not contingent on humanity, such as the attributes of gold, we have to consider the intersection between pragmata, so things in the world as they are, and humans' subjectivity, things how they are thought to be. We already covered such examples like monetary value and Magritte's pipe. They are physical items, yet how we think of them for our purposes in the given situation does not necessarily correspond to what they are, or more specifically, what we think they should be. Which brings us to the next section about relativism and objectivity, because this raises many questions. It seems that we can no longer speak about anything with a degree of certainty. If everyone is the measure of things, then how can we possibly find any sort of agreement as to what those things are in any objective sense? Is not relativism leading to absurdity? If you claim that everything is relative, does that not annul the proposition itself? Does that not cancel the very claim that everything is relative? Since it too would also have to be relative and thus not always applicable? There are so many questions. Though I feel the relativist inferences might miss the nuance in the distinction between hrimata and pragmata, which is why I elaborated on hrimata at length. It is not that the world has no constants. For example, there is no subjectivity involved on whether the Earth has gravitational pull on us. That is objective. If there is some careless relativist out there who insists otherwise, you can always convince them about the fact by urging them to jump off a cliff in order to test their hypothesis. Then we will see whether their views correspond to what is actually happening. Our point then is more subtle. We talk about hrimata. When we are talking about hrimata, we are not denying the underlying reality. Instead, we are highlighting the human aspect of how this state of affairs is brought into the personal or interpersonal sphere and how it is interpreted in that context. Rather than deny objectivity, we emphasize the importance of the objective magnitudes at their intersection with human subjectivity as that applies to the evolving phenomena. What the distinction between pragmata and hrimata does at the level of how we reason about the world is to remind us that we should be extra careful and rigorous with how we study the objective magnitudes. Otherwise, we fall into traps. Where we assume as constant the categories that we already take for granted through our culture or some other deep-seated ideology. Think, for example, how influential the notions of individuality and free will are given the legal political order and its prevailing narratives. At least in my country, and I think most of the Western, so-called Western world. These are cultural constructs which we need to be mindful of. If we obsess about the individual, we fail to understand how any given person is biologically a system of systems that necessarily exists within a greater system of systems that extends from the person's immediate milieu to the Earth's ecosystems to the greater beyond of the living universe. In reality, there can be no individual as such, because nothing can have a decontextualized or a standalone presence. The very notion of individual, meaning indivisible, is a convention and mental shortcut because it rests on a binary that is analytical. The human on one side and the society on the other side, both of them treated as such. Analytics, as I have mentioned in previous presentations, involve mental representations of patterns which we treat as if, this is very important, they have a standalone presence. Though we know they do not have a standalone presence. They exist in the totality of all that exists. Next section rather. Conventions and nature. The human experience is organized around all sorts of conventions, such as the near sanctity of property and property rights, social classes, and the concomitant stratification of society. Stratification means society in classes, in strata. Stratification of society, the constructs of natural and legal persons, the rights of states, and so on and so forth. These are all institutions, meaning that they take effect through tradition, political expedience, sheer force, or anyhow are not a constant like, say, gravity. There are attempts to ground institutions in natural patterns, such as with the case of natural law and its manifestation as human rights. Those start with the observations about the human condition and ramify to the domain of law or jurisprudence. This is a laudable effort, though the fact remains that the so-called natural law is a contradiction in terms, because law is instituted as such, whereas that which is natural is not. Humanity cannot promulgate some piece of legislation which will, for example, envisage that the sun shall no longer rise from the east. No legal instrument can do that. No institution can affect such a phenomenon. The sun rises from the east due to a natural state of affairs which will be that way regardless of how humans think of it. Again, we see the distinction between pragmata and hrimata. Why does this matter anyway? Is it not obvious that laws are made by humans for humans? Yes, that much is clear. What is not always apparent is that whatever is instituted as such can be reinstituted, meaning that its claims on necessary objectivity are untrue. This is not to argue that hrimata are somehow bad, that natural law is irrelevant or undesirable, or anything along those lines. It is to stress the nuanced point that we should not conflate our subjectivity with objectivity, else we run the risk of falling victim to our own prejudices. There is no reason, for example, why less than 1% of the world's population holds 50% of the wealth. This is not a necessary condition of the universe, but a matter of convention. It can be made different if people want it to be different. There are insights we can derive from nature to inform our conduct, such as what I described in my presentation about ataraxia, moderation, and mysticism. Acknowledging the presence of hrimata is all about avoiding potential errors in judgment, not dismissing moral considerations altogether, not trying to justify arbitrariness, not implying that there is no objectivity whatsoever. Which brings us to the next section about pragmata and cosmopolitanism. So cosmopolitanism is kind of a misused term nowadays, as it either denotes an ideology of internationalism or it describes a lifestyle of affluence that is not limited to any one locale. For example, people who want the United Nations to turn into a federal system with its own government may describe themselves as cosmopolites or as having a cosmopolitan outlook. As for the lifestyle choice, we hear about how some rich fellow is, say, an American citizen who dines at the finest French restaurants, drinks the most refined Italian wine, is a collector of medieval Chinese artifacts, and lives in several countries around the planet. Then there is also the pejorative term used by some political parties who associate those so-called rootless cosmopolitans with various perceived evils. Those evils can take a variety of form depending on the specifics of the ideology, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is that they all revolve around this lifestyle or this kind of ideological framework. The point is that these uses of the term cosmopolitanism and its variants are not faithful to the original meaning, at least in my opinion. Let's consider the original meaning, the story, in brief. There was an ancient philosopher by the name of Diogenes. He is known as Diogenes the Cynic, or Diogenes of Sinope, referring to his school of thought and hometown respectively. While in Sinope, Diogenes at some point defaced the local currency, which was illegal back then, just as it is today. He was thus exiled from the city, which rendered him stateless, because at that time states were limited to cities. They were city-states. So outside the city there was no state. So Diogenes was stateless. Diogenes then could no longer claim to be a politis, which means citizen, of any given polis or else city. He couldn't be a citizen without a city. That would make no sense whatsoever. He was deprived of the status of citizen because he was an outcast. So when people would ask Diogenes about his citizenship, he would reply that he is a citizen of the world, else politis tu cosmou, politis of the cosmos, citizen of the world. The literal meaning of citizen of the world involves a contradiction. One can only be a citizen of a state, or more generally, be the subject of a given legal institutional order. It is impossible to be a citizen in the absence of a polity, a citizen of nowhere. That makes no sense. We thus have to assume, based on Diogenes' philosophical views, at least the snippets that we get from those views, what remains in history. So we have to infer from those, at least I will theorize accordingly, that cosmopolitis is a normative claim about how a person's conduct should be aligned with the cosmos. So politis of the cosmos. or as I see it, with the cosmos, logos, and the living universe. In practical terms, we can think of cosmopolitanism as the continuation of the distinction between pragmata and hrimata in the domain of ethics or politics. The argument would be that whatever principle governs our conduct, so our conduct in everyday affairs, our morality, our politics, must trace its source to pragmata instead of being some arbitrary convention that we take for granted for whatever reason. Think, for example, about the notion of respecting people. We are taught to respect authority, though there is no natural constant that makes such a phenomenon necessary. It is a matter of upbringing, of culture, of convention. Perhaps it is useful and practical, but that still does not make it anything more than a hrimata. So continuing with this theme, on this matter of respecting authority, Diogenes was clearly a contrarian. He was sold as a slave since he was homeless. He fell prey to slave traders. So he was sold as a slave, and when asked about what kind of job he was good at, he replied, governing people. Of course, this is ironic. It comes with an ironic sense to it, which hints at the fact that both the slave and the master are instituted as such. Their status is not a natural condition. It is not in the nature of things for some people to be slaves and for others to be masters. So we can see Diogenes maintaining the same stance, so the same commitment to the nature of things, to pragmata, to being a citizen of the cosmos, with regard to his stance vis-a-vis Alexander. Alexander, who is most commonly known as Alexander the Great, Alexander of Macedonia. When Alexander met Diogenes and asked him what he wanted from the aspiring despot of the earth, the known world as it was called, Diogenes only asked to not be kept in the shadow. This has the literal meaning of asking Alexander to step aside so as to not obstruct the sunlight, but also has the metaphorical sense of telling the conqueror not to impose tyranny, not to hinder one's enlightenment, not to keep us in the shadows. Cosmopolitanism, then, is the call to develop the methods that are necessary for distinguishing between hrimata and pragmata in order to find the truth of the latter. Otherwise, how can you be a citizen of the cosmos if you do not understand what the cosmos is? So you must develop the requisite methods, the requisite means of understanding the cosmos in order to align yourself with the cosmos. So once we learn about the pragmata, we can develop a more informed view of the world, a better morality, a more just polity. Cosmopolitanism also relates to what I covered in my previous presentation about ataraxia, moderation, and mysticism, such as the realization that we as individuals or as a species are not the epicenter of the world. We are but a part of a greater system, citizens of the greater polis, so to speak. Furthermore, knowledge of the pragmata is consistent with what I already mentioned in that talk, so in my previous talk, about knowing our limits, avoiding hubris, and leading a life of moderation. Perhaps we will not be able to fully overcome hrimata, because that requires that we remove, withdraw, exclude the subjective aspect from everything we perceive. Is that even possible? Regardless of the answer, we can always try to approximate the truth of the cosmos and align ourselves with that truth. Which brings us to the use of the term politis, citizen. By studying the cosmos, we want to develop insights which will underpin our laws and institutions. Our citizenship, then, our real affiliation, will be with a moral code that reflects the logos of the universe and is not limited to some cultural constructs. Our allegiance will not be to our notional tribe, our government, or some borders on a map, but to the objectivity of the world, the common in the multitude that we can identify in all humans and all other forms of life. Which brings me to the final point of today's presentation, and that is the utility of ideas. Whether cosmopolitanism in the sense of an objective morality, as I just described, is realizable, is a matter of discussion. I think it is a useful ideal that can help guide our actions, but we should be careful not to mistake it for a directly applicable set of instructions. We cannot implement an objective morality because we do not have the clarity to grasp perfect objectivity. This is due to our lack of foresight and knowledge about the totality of the universe. There is always some case that makes us question how workable any given ethical system is. There is always some unforeseen event or a set of outcomes which makes us question the efficacy of our designs. The claim on an objective and thus universally applicable morality is dubious, as it necessarily involves interpretation. I would even consider it hubris to believe that your ethics are fully objective. Hubris, in the sense I already explained in my previous presentation, as the unwillingness or inability to recognize our limits, all while overestimating our potential. If you think you have discovered a complete and objective moral code, then you are implying that you hold the corresponding knowledge of the workings of the cosmos and are certain of your findings. Is your certainty justified? Is your knowledge perfect, meaning that it can take no further refinements? I think not, and would thus question any claims on the totalizing reach of any one system of morality. We should thus be careful with the kind of idealism that Diogenes might have argued for, or at least what I understand of what Diogenes was saying. So this is my theory and not necessarily what Diogenes said, okay? While we might agree with some principle, any principle, doesn't really matter, we have to understand what our condition as humans renders possible in the here and now, as we say. We cannot live in an ideal polity because we ourselves are not ideal humans. We have our flaws, defects, frailties of character, biases, and instincts or emotions which run contrary to our reasonableness and which might inhibit our mystical ascension. And we are not omniscient, which means that we cannot be perfectly sure about the completeness of our findings regarding the world at large. The ideal must serve as our guide. It must be the lodestar, the brightest star in the sky that helps us orientate ourselves amidst the uncharted wilderness. We should try our best to approximate the ideal with the understanding that we cannot ever attain it in full. That is so due to the fact that ideals are absolute, whereas the specifics in each case are not absolute. Approximations are all we can ever hope for. And we conclude with this point. We continue on the topic of the utility of ideals. So all this brings us back to the Delphic maxims that I covered in more detail in my previous video about ataraxia, moderation, and mysticism. The first of those is to know yourself, and I want to explain it a bit here. Given the interconnectedness of the universe, this means that you must commit to the study of the world in order to start realizing how you relate to all other forms of being and how your selfhood takes form. Is your understanding complete, or are you always learning something new? And what does that entail for your sense of self? So know yourself is no mean feat. You don't just know yourself and that's it. You have to commit to it. You have to continuously research and continuously be open to the possibility of knowing yourself, of learning and relearning about yourself. The second maxim from the Temple of Apollo in Delphi is nothing in excess. And again, I will explain it here for our purposes, which is to try to find the balance in everything that you do. Exaggerations are reducible to errors in judgment. For example, if you are certain that you know yourself, and by extension the cosmos, you are overly confident in your abilities, which means that you are ignoring the boundaries imposed upon you by your nature as an imperfect animal. Consequently, by exaggerating, you are making a mistake, despite your opinion to the contrary. And the third maxim that I will also explain, this one is a bit more difficult to translate literally. So it says, ensure, and that if you do so, ruin follows. And we can loosely translate it as certainty brings ruin, or if you be sure of things, that will bring ruin upon you, or something along those lines. While you are learning about the world and yourself, and you are trying to live in moderation, so without excesses, you necessarily maintain a dubitative and inquisitive disposition. So you are doubting, you are always wondering, you don't take things for granted. And you are inquisitive, meaning that you are always searching, you are always inquiring upon how things stand, upon the nature of things. So you always have this dubitative and inquisitive disposition. You are not claiming to know everything. You do not claim to know everything. When, however, you make claims that hint at omniscience, when you overestimate your abilities, you run the risk of being corrected the hard way. Kind of how I said before that the careless relativist could try to prove their point against gravity by jumping off a cliff. If they are certain that everything is a relative social construct, then they will only be ruined by their certainty. if they try to jump off the cliff. Because the cliff is not a social construct, the gravity is not a social construct. In conclusion then, the distinction between pragmata and hrimata does not introduce arbitrariness. It is a nuanced point in favor of not taking things at face value, not assuming that we know everything, not conflating our opinions or cultural outlook with objective magnitudes. Simply put, we want to be extra careful with how we study phenomena. We must raise the standard, as we must always try to understand the factors at play, the constitution of the case, and the dynamics involved. In everyday life, that sort of attitude will make us more tolerant of other views. We will not be taking our opinions as inherently superior to those of others, at least not without giving the others a fair chance to speak their mind. When we all do that, we are better off as a culture, as a civilization, as we help each other out in sorting out the falsehoods through genuine exchange and compassion. Conventions are not bad per se. They are needed to make our collective life work. What matters is that whatever is instituted can always be instituted anew. It can always be reinstituted as part of a continuous process of refinement or sincere experimentation in pursuit of the truth. Can we become citizens of the cosmos? We can always try to approximate that ideal while understanding what our limits are. Else, we have to suffer from our hubris. And that's all for today's presentation, folks. Thank you very much for your attention. As I said, today's presentation will be available on my website. I will provide a link in the description in case you are watching this on the video hosting platform. Of course, if you are keeping up with the updates on my website, you will get this update as well of this new publication. So thank you very much for your attention, and there will be more videos about philosophy in the coming days and weeks. So thank you very much. Goodbye for now.